Hi everyone, this is Avital Breverman with the Hydrologic Engineering Center. This video is a recording of a webinar that was given to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Hydrology, Hydraulics, and Coastal Community of Practice in May 2023. Within this presentation, Mike Bartels, Greg Karlovitz, and I give an overview of an ongoing federal interagency work unit that is improving mixed population flood frequency analyses throughout the United States. Thanks for watching and enjoy.
We're really excited to present on this. It's going to be kind of a multifaceted presentation. We want to outline the problem a little bit and then talk about how we're going about solving it. Right now, this is a work unit that's in progress. So unfortunately for everybody, we don't have all the answers yet, but we do have a clear roadmap, and that's what we really want to share with everybody today. So kind of in 4 parts, we want to talk a little bit about why mixed populations are such an impactful part of doing a good flood frequency analysis, and how in many places in the United States, there's something you simply can't ignore. I want to talk a little bit about the special work unit that's been formed. It's kind of originated by FEMA, but it's right now an effort that's being collaboratively solved by FEMA, the USGS, and U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And so we have a large team that's trying to address this problem, and we'll talk a little bit about that work unit and kind of our goals. And then we'll get you up to date with some of our progress in this work unit and just what our plans are for the future and where we're going from here. So what I want to do is I want to preface this a little bit first to say that we don't have all the answers yet. So if you were coming on today hoping because whenever you go to do a flood frequency analysis in your district, that you realize that the floods in your area are caused by a lot of different things, and it makes it really challenging to do flood frequency analysis. And unfortunately, we don't have all the answers yet. But what this work unit is, this is our opportunity to collaborate with a lot of people who have a lot of expertise in this area and try to address a really long-standing problem in flood frequency analysis that's been identified for a long time. And really, this is a problem that, whether or not you know it, it probably affects the work that you're doing in your district. And so this is really impactful and a great opportunity to do a better job in flood frequency analysis. Long term, the plans are to make sure that all of the results of this work unit are as public as possible, and that could go as far as integration in something like the water data that you get from the USGS. And so really right now, we just want you to know we're on the case and we're doing the best we can to move this thing along and get you some answers. So with that, I will turn it over to Mike.
Great. Thank you, Greg. Yeah, Chase is on the case. We're working on it. We have fully transitioned, my son now has fully transitioned into the 1980s Transformers phase. There's a lot more going on in the Transformers than there was in Paw Patrol, so I got to keep up with that. It's been 30 years since I watched that show. Good times. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the background on mixed populations, essentially why you should care about this. What are these things? Why are they important? What's some of the historical perspective on them? So stick with me here. First up, let's talk about some assumptions that goes into flood frequency analysis. If you've taken any of these classes from us, if you've read any of our presentations or seen any of our presentations, we always talk about this IID assumption. It means that we're assuming that the data that goes into your flood frequency analysis is independent and identically distributed. Typically, the independence assumption is okay. So we're using an annual maximum series that's separated by water year. The reason that we use a water year and choose the largest event per year is we're trying to ensure that the sample is independent. So we're not challenging that yet. We will challenge that in a little bit, but we are really challenging this identically distributed assumption at the end. In particular, that means that you're assuming that the population that you're fitting a distribution to is identically distributed. This comes from one single runoff mechanism, so on and so forth. And we really aren't doing an awesome job with that. So let's go to the next one. Oh, before we go there, I want to talk about this is an example of a well-behaved distribution, first and foremost. I'm not talking about it being plotting in a straight line or anything else like that. There's nothing funky going on with this distribution. The distribution fits the sample relatively well. Everything is well-behaved. We'll talk about some ones that aren't necessarily well-behaved here and identify the problem. All right. In most cases, actually, throughout the United States, more than one mechanism creates floods, right? Significant portions of the country are affected by snowmelt. Everything gets rain pretty much all the time. Tropical storms make landfall all over the place. Here's a simple example in the lower right-hand corner. We got rain floods that are represented by the orange dots. The orange line is the distribution that was fit to those rain floods. Tropical storms are those green triangles, and the distribution that was fit to them is that green line. Notice how different and disparate they are. If they're very, very different, you definitely want to split those guys out. If we were to put them all together and actually fit a distribution to them, assuming that they were IID, that combined sample, we would come up with a very different result in distribution. The combined curve that's shown here in red is a result of splitting into two separate samples, fitting independently of one another, and then combining them together with probability of union. If we treated them all the same, we would get a very, very different distribution. So the difference in the frequency magnitude of the individual samples themselves is really meaningful. If they're not that different, right? If the green and the orange plotted right on top of one another and you split them and then you put them back together again, you would probably get the exact same result as if you didn't split them. But in this case, they are very, very different. Let's go to the next one. There's a lot of different ways in which mixed populations occur. Here's a graphic for the United States, right? Every single one of these different colors and regions are essentially the result of a clustering analysis that got at how different mechanisms occur throughout the entire country. Everywhere you look, there's different mechanisms. We have a very unique set of meteorology and land surface processes throughout the US that result in these things being disparate from one another. You can have really long-term meteorologic conditions like El Nino that last for months to years. You have tropical cyclones, atmospheric rivers that you can see coming from a very long way away. You have local thunderstorms that come up really, really quickly. Those are all examples of meteorologic processes that can result in different runoff mechanisms. But then you can also have land surface processes, right? Because we're interested in the conversion of precipitation to runoff. That's what we're typically fitting a distribution to, right? So rain that falls on bare ground is going to respond very differently to rain that falls on snow. It's going to respond very differently to just snow melting because it's warm outside and the sun is shining. Antecedent soil moisture comes into play when the soil is already saturated versus when it's not as rain falls. Ice jams are a well-documented form of mixed populations as well, particularly in the upper Midwest, right? Especially when we're analyzing stage frequency, those things can be very, very difficult to analyze. And one that's come up a whole lot in our neck of the woods out here in California a lot is wildfire. Before and after wildfire, the land surface responds very, very differently. The exact same amount of precipitation falling on a pre-burned area versus a post-fire area is going to respond much, much differently. And that changes throughout time, too. So there's lots of different ways that you can get mixed populations arising in a particular area. All right, go ahead to the next one. So in fitting an analytical probability distribution, again, we're assuming that floods are independent and identically distributed. We violate that assumption when we assume that everything is perfectly identically distributed when in fact it's not actually that. Let's talk about where the rubber meets the road there. We use frequency distributions, or these analytical probability distributions, quite often. In analyzing trends, right? We're interested in seeing how one mechanism may be changing over time, right? If we don't split, we're not going to get a really good idea of how those things change over time. We like to regionalize and trade space for time quite frequently. And we combine a lot of these different sites together to inform our regional perspective of, say, regional skew. If we don't split by causal mechanism, we're not going to get a really good regional skew estimate, right? That could be a major problem. One that we live in each and every day is extrapolation to rare exceedance probabilities, right? I love this figure, putting the question mark out there, just like, are we doing a good job when we extrapolate to rare AEP? When you think about it, we don't have that much observed data, especially when we're extrapolating to 1 in 10,000, as we are in this case, 1 in a million, 1 in 10 million for dam safety and levee safety decisions. We have to do that, right? And we do this for floodplain management type of studies too. This is the world in which we live within the Corps of Engineers each and every day. Are we doing a good job extrapolating, right? In this example here, what I did was I took a population and I fit an analytical distribution to it, assuming that it was a single runoff mechanism, everything was all good, and I got the blue line. Then I separated by causal mechanism, actually did a good job of doing flood typing, fit two different distributions and combined them together using probability of union, and the red line is what resulted. The red line is more appropriate, right? See how much they differ, especially at the rare AEP. When we extrapolate, we can get drastically different results. In this case, they're tens of thousands of CFS different at the 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000 AEP, where we usually are making investment decisions. So better modeling is going to improve our investment decisions and do a better job quantifying damages and benefits of any proposed project. Now we go to the next one. Some more on why we care. This thing has been around for this problem has been around for a really, really long time, right? Leo Beard, hopefully you guys know him. He's the godfather of HEC. He created HEC. Before he created HEC, in 1962, he wrote a really, really good paper called Statistical Methods in Hydrology. It was so good that we actually made a class and named it after it. But it's a very good read. If you go and check it out, there's a specific section in here on floods in New England, right? So this is just an example of this problem cropping up, people being like, what is happening here? In particular, he's talking about the upward curvature in a flood frequency distributions fit to an annual maximum series that has a whole bunch of different runoff mechanisms. That crazy positive skew that you get is a function of a few events that have undue leverage on the actual distribution. An example is shown here on the left for a location within Pennsylvania on Bushkill Creek. Anytime you have a positive skew of like close to 1 in log space, that should be cause for concern. Something funky is going on here. Does that distribution do a good job of extrapolation or predicting floods when we extrapolate the rare AEP? Leo Beard noted that I don't think we're doing a good job of that. We want to split by cause and mechanism, but that doesn't entirely solve the problem. We got to do something else with it. All right, go ahead to the next one, Greg. Here's another example on the other side of the country where we're not doing a good job of interpolating in between the observed data. So what I have shown on the left-hand side is a year-over-year plot where I split out the years, throw those away, and I just want to show when do the annual maxima occur based upon day, month, right? And you can see that there's a really strong clustering towards the end of April through the beginning of June-ish timeframe. Those are snowmelt floods. This is in the Sierra Nevada. It's actually specifically right by HHC Dam. Snowmelt floods are pretty regular. The mean and standard deviation aren't that crazy here. There's not a whole lot of variance that's going on here. It's very predictable when snowmelt floods, their magnitude, right? But what is unpredictable is when you get atmospheric rivers that dump a whole bunch of moisture and usually snow. Those are those other floods that are really wild. Their variance is very, very large. And when you treat everything as a combined population, you get the figure that's shown on the right. That crazy J-hook there, drawing a line right through the middle of that is not going to work out very, very well, especially when you extrapolate. But we are even doing a poor job of estimating the exceedance probability of commonly occurring events, things that we have experienced, right? When you see something like this, this is a really good indicator that it's a mixed population. You should be separating them in to separate causal mechanisms. All right, we go to the next slide. A thumbs down, major big thumbs down on that one. Nobody likes to see that. All right, in Bulletin 17B, the authors even talked about this, right? They gave you an idea of like what to do. We want to separate by causal mechanism. And they also said, don't do this. Don't separate just by the time of year, right? Because the causal mechanisms can cross those boundaries. If you say before April 15th, any floods that occurred caused by this single mechanism, it's like, well, what if you get a flood one year that occurred on like 16th of April by that specific flood mechanism? You got to do a better job of doing that. Specifically, don't just split by the date. All right, go to the next slide. And they even said, we wanted to study this more, right? Look in the left-hand figure at 1B. We wanted to study this more. We wanted to come up with a step-by-step list of procedures that you can go through to do that, but we ran out of time. So let's kick the can into future studies. Say, hey, number 2, we want to identify and treat mixed distributions better. Let's do a better job of that in the future. Bulletin 17C was released in 2019. And that was also listed as mixed populations, was also listed as, hey, this is a problem. The language is very, very similar, you'll find, because they actually adopted very similar language to Bulletin 17B. They provided some more supporting details and also identified some additional problems. The problem was it was also listed in future studies. There was no step-by-step list of like, this is how we're going to go about doing these types of analyses. All right, so what has taken so long? It's hard to classify flood types. We also get into problems because the backbone of what we do is predicated upon the availability of an annual maximum series. We have a lot of those throughout the country, right? Classifying flood types can be time consuming. We would like to do a better job of that, developing automated procedures. Avital and Greg are going to talk about that quite a bit, so we want to speed that process up, and we also want to standardize it. But we also run into other problems that are kind of difficult and hairy to solve. If we subdivide an annual maximum series that's shown on the left here into two separate causal mechanisms, we reduce the number of events in each sample, right? We introduce uncertainty by doing that. So we take an already limited sample, right? We're upset that we only have, say, 60 years of data and we have to extrapolate to 1 in a million. And we're not happy that we have to extrapolate so much beyond the range of observed data. Well, how would you like to extrapolate if I told you to split that in half, right? You probably would feel even worse about it. How do we get around this, right? If you've taken any statistical methods or flood frequency analysis classes from us, if you see any presentations that I've given on the use of Bulletin 17C procedures, if you use this many perception thresholds, you're doing something wrong. This is essentially what you're left with when you take an annual maximum series and divide by causal mechanism, where some years you don't have an annual maximum for that specific mechanism. What do you do about that? So we're missing the how, and there's no quantitative guidance, and nothing is standardized with how to do that. We would like to do a better job of that. All right, as an example of how to do a better job with that, we pull up a great study by the Omaha District on the Lower Platte River. So major shout out to you guys. You know who you are, doing a good job out there. They wanted to come up with flood frequency estimates for the Lower Platte River at all these locations that are shown here in red. So mixed populations come into play in this case. We got rain floods, snowmelt floods, rain on snow conditions. You can even have ice jams, other things like that. It would be nice to separate those by causal mechanism and then combine by probability of union. And what they actually did was they used the accumulated freezing degree days as an indicator, and along with precipitation and snow depth and stuff like that, as an indicator of whether or not a peak was caused by rainfall or a peak was caused by snowmelt. And the figure on the left, or well, right in the middle, you can see that this peak was caused by rainfall because the snow was essentially gone, right? By the time the stream flow in the bottom actually peaked, and you got the actual annual maxima for that specific year, snow was gone. You were well past the peak of accumulated freezing degree days. On the right-hand side, you see an indication where the peak occurred pretty much right at the same time that you had snow melt that was going on. This is a quantitative way to say that this was caused by snow, this was caused by rainfall. I'm going to put it in an appropriate bucket and do that. However, the problem is this takes a lot of time to go through every single water year, right? Let me do the animation for me, Greg. Major thumbs down on this one. This takes a lot of time. We got to make improvements on this one. I don't want everybody to be taking 2 months to separate by causal mechanism, right? And I also don't want everybody to be like, my accumulated freezing degree days separated by my peak by 7 days. I'm going to call that a rainfall flood. Where somebody else says, 7 days? Yeah, I'm going to call that a snowmelt flood. It's not standardized, right? We all need to agree upon the indices that are actually being used to make these determinations and also their rate of change thresholds. 995 south. All right. I'll kick it over to Greg and talk about how we're going to actually solve these things.
All right, thanks. I'm going to take this opportunity to remind people you might think you're on mute, but you are not. There are some people on my naughty list right now who have not muted their phones, so please take the opportunity to do that right now. In order to solve this problem, it's not a simple problem, and so we're putting a little bit of a super team together. This is at the behest of FEMA, who's been our benefactor on a number of big advancements in the kind of the recent past here. This specific work was sparked by an interagency agreement with FEMA that was signed in the end of FY22, and really the work in earnest started early this fiscal year. But really what FEMA is doing is tasking the U.S. Geologic Survey and the Corps of Engineers to collaborate on supporting FEMA in its future flood risk data initiative. And so you may have heard some rumblings about this. FFRD is kind of a big deal. It's going to totally change the way that FEMA does flood insurance and also just administers the entire National Flood Insurance Program. A big part of this is in the way that they're doing their flood mapping. And so with a number of different efforts kind of combining to improve their flood mapping efforts, one of the big open questions is, what can we do better in the realm of flood frequency analysis? And so we took a bite out of one of the big outstanding problems in flood frequency by trying to tackle this mixed populations issue. Within this agreement, there's really four big priorities. The first one is, how do we actually do flood frequency analysis for mixed populations? What does the literature say that we should do? What is good that we find out of doing studies ourselves? That's kind of the big center of this whole thing. But then it's, how do we take this and make this useful for other people to use? We could roll all this stuff up and publish a journal paper or write a report and have it sit on a shelf. But really what we want to be able to do is make this operationally possible for people to do in the field. And what that means is coming up with automated methods for flood type classification. It also makes us need to come up with a plan for implementing this nationally, being able to do this at any location in the United States, because that is also where FEMA needs to make its risk rating determinations for flood insurance. And then there's an additional task in here, and this is largely being spearheaded by the USGS because of their requirements as well, but also being able to account for future changes in causal mechanisms. So with the effect of climate change, how do we expect not necessarily the flood frequency behavior of an individual mechanism to change, but potentially how do we expect the relative frequency of those classifications to change in a future climate? The team is kind of big, and it's kind of got four parts in here. From FEMA, there's a couple of folks that we've been collaborating with. Christina and Dave have been tremendous partners from FEMA, and they've done a really good job at helping us interface with FEMA headquarters largely as a whole so that we can continue to support FFRD. We've involved several folks at the USGS from a number of their water science centers. The way that USGS kind of works is they're more geographically based, sort of like how our districts work, but they have a lot of people who I would consider national experts at those water science centers. And so we've been able to engage with people across the country who are kind of the best of the best at tackling this problem. And so it's kind of an all-star team from the USGS, which it's been great to have on board. We've involved the MMC to help with the project management tasks and really helping us keep all of this, moving and all the moving parts organized. We really kind of are grateful for having MMC involved and keeping everything kind of on an even keel and interfacing with FEMA and also helping us manage all of our tasks. It's been really nice to have them on board. And then kind of from the Corps' perspective, there's a number of people from HEC. 3 of 4 of us are presenting today. Will Lehman, who's also been kind of the driving force behind the Corps' involvement in FEMA's FFRD, he is also involved in this effort. John England from the Risk Management Center, he's been involved in this as well. And then we recently picked up Jason Caldwell from ERDIC CHL, who has some experience in some of this realm in the past, so that we can continue to move some of this stuff forward. So it's a big team with a lot of moving parts, but really it's the right group of people for the job, which is really encouraging. So the general approach, I'm kind of a flowchart kind of person, but this is just a highly conceptualized version of what we're doing. Really, the whole thing starts with figuring out what other smart people know already. We've got a lot of experience internally in doing these sorts of things on our studies, but there's also a really big body of literature out there on not only identifying flood and storm types, but also how do you make meaningful sense of the data that you get when you go about doing that typing exercise. We also hope that's going to help us identify what data that we can use and what statistical techniques we can use for separating out these floods in an automatic way. The data part is no small deal. Having data sets that are good for the whole of the United States for long periods of record that help us make informed decisions about what types of floods we're seeing is very, very valuable. And so seeing what other people have done and how they've evaluated data sets for that fitness is really important for us to succeed. What we're doing also is we're doing a number of pilot studies in conjunction with this in order for us to test our methods out, see what works, see what doesn't work, and then help us refine the data and methods that we're proposing to use kind of as part of our overall plan and overall guidance for everybody. The pilot studies we'll talk a little more detail about them, but they're intentionally diverse in their flood types, in their geography, and it really is meant to help us decide what's working and what's not, and really give us an ability to do this operationally so that we can see where the pain points might potentially be and help smooth this out with more data or more recommendations on guidance. And then finally, we're going to go down this road of scoping a national rollout. And what that's really going to mean is that anybody is going to be able to do this operationally, and this is going to interface with the services that USGS already provides through their data. Their gateway towards acquiring flow data is amazing. It makes our jobs really easy in comparison to what it could be. And so what we want to do is we want to leverage that and make sure that the things that we're discovering here and the sort of data that we're going to generate can be used as part of the USGS's service to the public. So in the end goal is we want to be able to integrate with the National Water Information System, which is provided by the USGS. And so anybody who's played with peak flow data before, or any of the other things like instantaneous or daily flow data before, you know how convenient it is to pull all of this stuff down. And what you know is that not just the data are provided, but also a bunch of information potentially about the nature of that data, or what we would call metadata in some of those situations. So if you've got a peak flow file, let's look at the first 3 columns of this table right here. Normally what you get is you get the water year, you get the stream flow, which corresponds to some peak instantaneous flow, and some qualification codes which tell you a little more information. Is this an estimated peak? Is the date of the peak actually known? Is this a historical peak? Things like that. What the intention would be is to expand this table out in order to provide some sort of standardized type code for a specific site, for example, what caused that peak flow in a given year. Now, Mike already alluded to this, but there is a problem with dividing up our record in that sort of way. Really what this does is it costs us data. So if you have a site that's affected by, say, 3 or even more types of floods, if you take that peak flow data and you divide it up and you say, okay, for the year 1851, the annual maximum was a type A flood, then we don't have any data for the type B or the type C or any further types of floods in there. And so you could see how this subdivides the record and makes our sample size for fitting a model to each of the individual annual maximum types might increase our sample error, right? If you've taken any of our classes, you've seen that the primary driving thing that creates uncertainty around our fitted models is the sample size. And so any exercise where we're reducing the sample size can be a bit of a problem. So what we're really hoping to do is use as much data as we can possibly muster to understand what secondary, tertiary, and other peaks smaller than the absolute annual maximum might be at a site, so that we can build out an individual annual maximum distribution that contains data potentially for all years that have that type of flood. Now, certain flood types don't happen in every year, and we acknowledge this. For example, you might even get flow at certain sites, especially in the arid Southwest, where they don't have flow at all for an entire year. And so special treatment of data that contain zeros or null values within that annual maximum record is something we have to do. But in the years where we do have those flood types, what we want to provide is the largest flood of that type in each year. And one of the things that was revealing in our collaboration with USGS in one of our early meetings, we found out that for a long time, the USGS was collecting partial duration series data, or peaks over threshold. And some of those observations are, the second, third, fourth largest peaks in a year that may be attributable to other types of floods. And so part of this is identifying what data are actually available to us, even just from a flow perspective, for us to be able to make evaluations of these types of models. So in the end goal, not only do we want to provide the data, but we want to provide the means for everybody to do it themselves. We also want to provide transparency, because obviously these things affect the investment decisions and are worth scrutiny. And so we want to be able to provide the algorithm and criteria for separating out the record should you choose to do so manually. We want to provide those IID samples for the identified mechanisms, as we would through something like NWIS peak flow or through another means, and also the detailed procedures for modeling the mixed populations at any site. So what do I do with the individual populations, those subsamples, and then what do I do to get to a single frequency curve that I can then use for making decisions? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Avital, and she's going to bring it on home with what we're all doing here.
Thanks, Greg. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys a roadmap, talk about the progress we've made and the steps that we've laid out in order to complete our 4-year work unit. So we didn't really start this work unit in earnest until October, the beginning of this fiscal year. And the first 2 tasks that we tackled or are still in progress of tackling are a literature review to summarize and synthesize the state of research and select pilot sites and regions that we can use to help develop our initial flood type classification. Next slide. So far from the literature review, I'll highlight some key findings. This has been a problem that's been known for a long time, dating back to at least the 1960s, if not before. This issue is not only relevant in the United States, but worldwide. There's been a lot of recent research come out of Europe on flood typing and
mixed population analyses. Separating floods into IID samples is not current state-of-the-art practice, right? You won't see it in NWIS peak flow files or anywhere else. It's a relatively manual and time-consuming process that people do on a regional basis. The definition of what constitutes a mixed population, there's no agreement on that, right? So different people have used different perspectives that I'll talk about next. The picture on the right here comes from one of the early hydroclimatic studies performed by Dr. Catherine Hirschbeck in the Gila River Basin in Arizona. And this took kind of a decision tree approach to subdivide into something like 8 or 10 flood types. These typing procedures are often manual, and so they're hard to scale up nationally or even to larger watersheds. So scalable and deployable is what our goal is here, but this does not yet exist. Next slide. So there's a recent review paper published in 2019 that kind of investigated all the existing flood type classifications. And these approaches generally fall into one of 3 categories that vary in spatial scale. So the largest perspective is a hydroclimatic perspective. And as we get smaller, we take more of a watershed state or a hydrological approach. And then the narrowest is a hydrograph approach. So some of these are more relevant in certain areas, but ultimately we'd like to leverage all 3. And there's a number of existing storm and flood type classification efforts that have been performed predominantly in the western US due to the impact of atmospheric rivers and the distinction between snowmelt and rainfall events. So a lot of these studies have focused in California, the Colorado Front Range. I just talked about the Gila River Basin, which has a variety of flood types. More recently, there was a precipitation typing study performed in the Trinity River for core dam safety purposes. And New England was the first region where mixed populations were identified as having impacts because of ice jam, tropical cyclone, and snowmelt events. So we'd like to expand this to eventually cover the entire country. Next slide, please. So some of the gaps we've identified, I'll start from the bottom actually. The biggest gap is that everyone has their own definition of mixed populations and flood type classification. This makes it hard to transfer and scale up those procedures. And so that's our end goal, right? Is a transferable, scalable, automated procedure so that no one has to spend a year flood typing their own site, right? We want to be able to do this in a more quick manner. A lot of the flood typing procedures have focused on at-site flood samples, right, which tend to be relatively short. And so leveraging stochastic simulation or Monte Carlo techniques will help us expand the data. A lot of different causal mechanisms have been investigated. Mike talked about a few, but there's been kind of a lack of investigation into frozen ground impacts and wildfire, which is a big issue out west nowadays, and has been for a long time. Validation of automated classification. I'll talk more about how we will use both human expert and automated procedures in order to expedite this. And a lot of the research has focused on historic flood types, right, predicting what we have in our NWIS peak flow file, but we're also interested in projecting how those flood types, their seasonality and their coincident occurrence will change in the future. So our pilot site selection, the goal is to select 3 representative watersheds with flood causal mechanisms that are transferable to other regions. So here I'm showing a table. We broadly classified the country into 3 meta regions. We realize this doesn't get at all the nuance of flood types and hydrology in everyone's region, but we broadly classified this into the humid east, the central or the plains portion of the country, and then the mountainous west. And within each of those meta regions, we identified smaller regions, right? For example, New England, Colorado Front Range, and then selected a representative watershed from each region. So if you don't see your watershed here, don't get too upset. We haven't finalized this, and I'll talk about how this pilot site selection is an iterative procedure. But the goal was to select watersheds that cover a diversity of criteria that I'll talk about on the next slide. Oh, I lied, 2 slides. So this is a national riverine flooding risk from FEMA's National Risk Index map. And this just shows that we have tried to cover the entire country as well as take into account other risk and indices that other people have developed for flood risk. Okay, so here are our screening and selection criteria that I talked about. So I'll just roll through them quickly. We are interested in aiming for a diversity in the ranking of these criteria. So first, is there a previous flood frequency and specifically a mixed population analysis? This helps us be nice to validate our approach against an existing one if we feel that it's worthwhile. Is there public interest, right? There's 3 federal agencies involved. We're also interested in investigating flood risk where people are most at risk. Record length and completeness. variety of causal mechanisms, right? So this can include compound flooding, as well as a diversity of meteorologic and land surface processes, anthropogenic and other changes in runoff response, right? This is something that we can't avoid, even if it makes it a little trickier to identify flood types. The availability of meteorological data. One of the most important ones that we thought about was how much of a problem from a statistical hydrology perspective have mixed populations caused with flood frequency analyses. Mike showed you some problematic and some non-problematic flood frequency analyses, and then considerations for social vulnerability and flood risk. So we ranked each region and each criteria from high to low. And we are interested in the diversity of ranking. So for example, we don't want to cherry pick sites that have long data availability, easily distinguishable flood mechanisms, and high quality meteorologic data, right? That would make our initial classification pretty easy, but would make it extremely difficult to scale that up, right? We have regions in the country that have orographic impacts, there's radar blockage, and so even if we have continuous spatially distributed meteorologic data, it might not be as high quality as in other locations. So our goal here is to span as many different hydrologically and data-related diverse regions, and then scale up from there. And we took a semi-quantitative, we took a semi-quantitative approach to this classification. So here are some of the diagnostic plots that we use. On the right is a data availability plot. So you'll see we have some sites within a region that have long records, right? Long peak flow records. That's what everyone wants to see. But then we have plenty of other sites that have short data records. And on the left here, we're investigating trends in the normalized flow magnitude. So we can see kind of a cyclic pattern, but this is something that we'll take into account. All right, so that's what we've done so far. We're still in preliminary stages. We are 7 months into a 4-year work unit, so I'll talk about the roadmap ahead. So next, we're going to identify data sources. Greg talked a little bit about that. We're interested in data sources that are uniform, or at least uniform in a region. We don't want to only rely on gauges, since spatial distribution is not consistent. And we're interested in data sources both for a historical classification as well as a future classification approach. We actually have to develop that classification scheme, right? We've talked a lot about existing classification methods, but we'd like to leverage both human expert and automated procedures, and the two will inform each other. Once we actually develop IID flood type samples, what do we do with them, right? It's not enough to just provide users with those samples. We actually have to implement those samples in a flood frequency analysis, and we'll investigate how to do that. We'll be updating flood quantile estimates in pilot regions and comparing the results from treatment of flood series as homogeneous versus mixed. We'll provide you, the users, with generalized procedures that we developed, and I'll talk more about that, and then develop a scope of work for national upscaling, which will include publications and training material. All right, so next up for us is data, right? What data can we leverage to classify existing or historic storm and flood types? And then what data sets do we need in order to apply the classification going forward? So like I said, we'll probably avoid using gauges because their spatial distribution is not uniform. We'll likely be working with gridded products and meteorologic databases. So I'm showing a few here. On the right is a tropical cyclone track inventory database. And on the left is integrated water vapor transport, right? These are readily available and they span a relatively long temporal range. And we'll also be, I haven't shown here, but we'll be using data to predict future changes to floods. Oh, thanks on the animation. All right, next up, classification. So a lot of the existing flood type classifications have been performed on a regional basis, right? And so it's a little bit less time consuming. It's a little bit more manageable to actually hire a meteorologist to sit down and comb over surface analysis maps or look through post-flood and storm databases. This is extremely time consuming. It's not feasible to do this for the entire country, but we will use this procedure to help inform our automated classification, right? That we will then expand and apply to more and more regions and use a data-driven approach. All right, so once we have our IID samples, we're not going to just turn it over. We are actually going to investigate how we implement a flood frequency analysis. Mike showed you an annual maximum series at a site that was subdivided into snowmelt and rainfall events, and you have gaps in your record, right? So how do we address that? What does the process look like once we have separated data? The probability of union, right, how we actually recombine these individual curves is not new. You've probably seen it in high school or college statistics. It's included in USACE guidance, and you can also perform a mixed population analysis in HHC SSP right now. But we have some other questions we need to answer, right? So is it better to stick with the annual max series peak flow file, right, that we're used to working with in a Bolton 17C analysis? Or are we better off using a continuous record, which might even have a daily time step, but provides us with an unbroken record? If we do use that unbroken mean daily streamflow data set, how do we reconvert that data back to instantaneous peaks? There's a couple of methods that have been proposed, regression and quantile mapping. We actually want to evaluate the performance of these methods. We're used to working with annual maximum series in Bolton 17C. Is partial duration series a better way to go, right? Does that allow us more flexibility in typing our floods? How do we best represent uncertainty in the combined curve, right? There's plenty of sources of uncertainty that we are going to have to account for, and leveraging record extension techniques to improve our IID samples to augment our data is something that we need to consider. So back to our pilot studies, I mentioned this is an iterative approach. Our initial goal is to cast as wide a net as possible to cover as many flood mechanisms as possible so that our initial classification is worthwhile and can be applied elsewhere. But we will revisit it as we learn more with our classification and we get more data to type these floods. Something we haven't talked about is regulations. This is a map of core dams, 740 that we manage and operate. And so we need to actually consider the effects of regulation, right? Is a flood caused by water that's been held back in flood control storage, or is it actually from a meteorologic or land surface driver? So the general process that we have to develop will include kind of 4 steps. And hopefully we're paying our flowchart tax here in this presentation, right? But we have indices or kind of the variables that we're going to use. So I'm showing an example here using snow water equivalent or SWE. We'll have data sources where we actually obtain this information from, and these will likely take the form of CONUS-wide or continent-wide products. And hopefully we'll have more than one for each index. We'll define data thresholds, right? So this uses a decision tree approach. So classic example here is if the change in SWE exceeds some value and the accumulated precipitation is below some value over an antecedent period, then we can assign a snowmelt type classification. But we'll develop this for multiple flood causal mechanisms, and this data will be publicly available so that you can actually see what's involved in the algorithm. All right, so upscaling, right? This is the challenge. So our goal is to select representative watersheds, develop a classification that works that we can validate with human expert approaches, and then take that approach and apply it to a nearby watershed that is hydrologically similar, experiences floods from similar causal mechanisms, and then iterate, right? We might have to expand that classification. We might have to add ice jams if we go north and we are experiencing floods from additional mechanisms that weren't included in our initial pilot region. And the goal is to keep expanding to as large a region as possible where our initial classification works and iterate until we feel comfortable with the results. And finally, we want to publish our findings, right? So this will take both the form of journal publications, but tech transfer material. We want to provide training and users documentation, not only so that you understand the justification for the flood types that we produce, but so that there's an algorithm that's publicly available that users can apply going forward, right? So if you have to do a flood frequency analysis 20 years from now, you will have the tools in hand to assign types to floods that have occurred between the end of our work unit and when you have to perform our analysis.